1, I'm applying masking fluid to the snow on the branches and tree trunks. So I'm going to allow the masking fluid to dry naturally. So for step 2, I'm painting the sky and the background trees. So once you've mixed your colours, wet the whole of the sky area right down to the horizon. So my first tip for creating vibrant washes and making your paintings and washes look less dull is to make sure you have your palette clean, your water pot clean, your brushes clean, because it can actually contaminate your paint, and actually it can actually make them look a little bit muddy, which will eventually make them look dull. So I'm really loading my brush here with that cobalt blue and the manganese mix, painting wet into wet with a large mop synthetic brush, using more of the manganese blue as I head towards the middle of the sky and towards the horizon. And I've left a little gap there at the top right for a cloud, and I'm swishing a little bit of red, very dilute red, wet into wet, just at the bottom of that cloud and a little bit towards the horizon, using the raw sienna as well mix, and it creates a beautiful warm colour. A little bit more of the manganese blue, painting that on the horizon area, wet into wet, and swishing my brush through the red and raw sienna wash there as well, wet into wet, letting the colours blend on the paper. Now, another tip to keep your paintings fresh and vibrant and less dull is don't over sort of mix on the paper. Try to paint an area once rather than going back and forth, especially if you're using different colours, because they can get a little bit muddy. So what I'm doing here is I'm mixing up slightly thicker colour here, slightly creamier, the cobalt blue and the manganese blue, so less water, more paint. I'm just painting a little bit more stronger colour at the top of the sky, damp into wet. Another way of mixing your colours on the paper without touching it with your brush is to tilt, get it to blend. That's just what I'm doing here. And it's another great tip to allow your paintings to look fresh and vibrant, is to actually mix and blend your colours while tilting, to get the colours to sort of mix on the paper without me having to touch them. Especially when you're painting skies, it's a great way of doing that. I'm just swishing a little bit more paint at the top there. It's a beautiful colour mix, those two. A little bit more of that manganese blue in the middle of the sky, pretty much wet into wet still. It's very wet here. And I just want to build up a little bit more of a stronger tone of value just underneath that cloud to bring it out. I'm mixing up some burnt sienna, and this is going to be for the distant trees, and I'm going to paint them wet in wet to start with. Now, if you're worried about your sky drying too quickly, mix up these washes beforehand so it gives you more time. So I've mixed up burnt sienna and raw sienna, and I'm painting it very carefully with my size 8 brush, wet into wet actually at the moment, around the people. My painting is on a flat surface, but I will tilt this as well to get it moving. So I'm just pushing some of this wet paint up into the wet sky to get some taller looking trees. Remember, don't labour this, just try to paint once and trust yourself, trust the process. I'm kind of varying the colours but using lots of the burnt sienna, and now I'm mixing up some of the cobalt blue with the burnt sienna and painting this wet into wet, carefully not painting over the edge of the snow, and also around the people there using the tip of my brush. I'm mixing up slightly creamier now paint, the cobalt blue with the burnt sienna. So you've got this lovely rich sort of dark sort of blue brown colour. I'm painting this damp into wet, so the surface is still quite wet but the paint's slightly creamier, and I'm painting just along the horizon using the tip of my size 8 brush. Now I'm going to tilt to get that slightly creamier paint to sort of blend and create some lovely edges, as you can see there, that look like the top of trees, etc. So I'm using the pointy end of the cuticle stick just to sort of tease the paint and create some thin marks that look like tree trunks or branches, and just sort of pulling that up into the sky there. and it's quite nice. And it's slightly thicker as well, the cuticle stick, than a cocktail stick. So I've mixed up some more dark colour now using the burnt sienna, the cobalt blue, about 50-50, and just sort of painting these sort of taller trees there, damp into wet still. So I'm applying a little bit more of that dark colour. That's the burnt sienna, about 70% burnt sienna with about 30% cobalt blue along that sort of horizon edge right at the bottom of the trees there, damp into damp, to finish off this stage. I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally. Now, I put the emphasis on the word naturally because this really is a game changer. If you allow your paintings to dry naturally without blow drying them with a hairdryer, using any sort of heat source on it, I guarantee you your paintings will look fresher, more vibrant, and certainly won't look dull if you follow the tips that I've shared with you in this tutorial. But just using this one tip really will help. So for step 3, I'm going to be painting some light washes on the snow. So I'm wetting the paper, but not everything. I'm leaving some areas unpainted because I want those areas to be white. So I'm using the synthetic mop and I'm painting wet in wet, some of the yellow here and there, leaving some of the white patches of paper as well. So just using the tip of the brush just to paint on this yellow. Another tip I'd like to share with you is, if you notice there, I really load my brush. I've got plenty of paint. So you're not going on with a very, so almost a dry brush and dragging the paint. Because when you paint like this with a fully loaded brush in these circumstances where you're doing washes, you will get such beautiful, vibrant washes, and it will give you more time as well. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally again. For step 4, I'm going to paint the tree trunks and branches wet on dry. I've mixed up here burnt sienna and a little bit of the cobalt blue. I'm using my size 4 brush and I'm painting quite quickly, sort of thin tree trunks in the distance there. For these taller trees here to the left of the painting, I've used a little bit more cobalt blue, but again, just sort of painting quite swiftly using my size 4 brush and even using a dry brush effect. So not much paint on the brush, using the belly of the brush to scrub. It creates the detail without painting too much detail. You're giving the impression. And I've turned the painting upside down just to paint these smaller branches using the tip of my brush here. I'm going to allow the painting to dry naturally once more. I'm going to start painting the darks underneath that masking fluid. So I'm using Paynes grey and burnt sienna. I want these branches to come forward away from those sort of fuzzy trees in the distance. So I've concentrated on painting directly underneath the masked out branches, but I'm also painting lots of other little twigs as well, wet on dry. So I'm using the size 4 brush and I've got burnt sienna and Paynes grey, about 70% Paynes grey and 30% burnt sienna. And I'm painting the tree trunks wet on dry. And take your time with this. And as you can see, I've turned my painting sideways and I'm keeping the branches very, very simple there. A little wriggly sort of wrist action there creates those sort of more natural sort of looking branches. So adding some more burnt sienna and the Paynes grey here, wet on dry, and just sort of working my way up from the bottom of the tree trunk to the top, painting a few of the branches, a little wriggle in the wrist there, just to get them looking more natural. I've decided to wet the bottom of the tree trunks, just using a clean damp brush, and just swipe off with my paper towel some of the paint, so that the bottom of the tree trunks look like they're in the snow. I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally once more. So I've mixed up cobalt blue with alizarin crimson. You can use Winsor Red. And I'm painting the shadows, which are sort of behind the trees, wet on dry, using the large synthetic mop brush. And my next tip is to use soft-haired brushes in watercolour, not bristle brushes or sort of very stiff synthetic brushes, because they don't really hold a lot of paint and they also disturb the paint underneath. You almost can't help it. So lovely soft-haired brushes, they can be synthetic, but as long as they glide over your watercolour paintings. And I'm also just loading my brush and painting that foreground there. Plenty of paint. Remember, you want your paints or your washes to look vibrant. So be generous with the paint. So I'm just sort of painting some of the shadows, and there's plenty of them in the photograph. Wet on dry, using the tip of the brush as well, because you've got the shadows of the branches there as well. So you've got thinner marks. Loading the brush again and painting the shadows in the foreground, sort of varying the marks, leaving lots of, and painting the shadows in the foreground, sort of varying the marks, leaving lots of gaps as well for that lighter wash to come through. That was the red and the raw sienna. And just to create a slightly stronger tonal value in the foreground, I've added a little bit more cobalt blue and the alizarin crimson mix, slightly thicker and darker, just to bring that foreground forward. For a bit of artistic license, I'm painting a lot more grasses than you can actually see in the photograph. So I'm using my size 2 round brush with a mixture of the burnt sienna, a little bit of the Paynes grey, but also a touch of raw sienna as well here and there. It's quite creamy because the painting is still damp. The shadows are still damp, so I'm just sort of painting little marks here and there, little dark bits here and there. It just sort of brings the painting to life. This is all pretty much damp into damp, and I quite like doing it around the bottom of the tree trunks because it just makes them look more natural. And just random little grasses just here and there. I'm just painting damp into damp using the raw sienna, the burnt sienna, and a little bit of the Paynes grey. I've mixed up some cobalt blue here with a pinch of the Paynes grey, and I'm sort of painting damp into damp. You could even do this wet on dry, a bit of a dry brush effect, just for marks or track marks in the snow there. I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally. For step 6, I'm going to paint the people wet on dry, and I'm going to use lots of bright colours. So I'm starting off with the Winsor Red, always like a pop of red in a painting. So all of my people have got hats and scarves, and I'm using my size 4 round brush to paint the people. Now, if you want a little bit of help painting people, I have actually published a video all about painting little people, and I will put a link for that tutorial in the description below. So I'm going to carry on painting my group of people here. And remember, you can change your group and have more people, less people. I've also got a little dog there as well. I'm adding a little bit of shadow here using a bit of Paynes grey. It's quite creamy, so it's damp into damp, just to add a touch of detail, not too much. And just adding a few more darks and details on the hats. And just painting the little boy's jacket here, a little bit of that manganese blue with cobalt blue. So just really nice bright colours. And what's fun is you can just sort of choose your own colours here and have fun with it. I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally once again. For step 7, I'm removing the masking fluid. I'm just going to soften some of the sort of edges of the masking fluid. And I'm using my size 8 brush, painting wet on dry, the shadow there. You can just keep it really loose. I'm using the cobalt blue and alizarin crimson mix with my size 4 round brush and painting some footprints here and there. I'm also adding a few little details to some of the grasses, just a few little marks here and there. You can use whatever leftover paint you have in your palette to create a bit of variety. I'm using the Paynes grey burnt sienna. For step 8, I'm going to paint a little bit of light on the right hand side of the people and just on their clothing here and there, just to really give them a little bit of sparkle. And I'm also going to finish with a spatter. I'm actually using a scrunched up piece of paper towel and printing with the white gouache to create some more texture. And of course, I couldn't resist having a little spatter. and I'm spattering it using my size 4 round brush just to get some really small marks. And here is the finished painting. If you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You will get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials and downloadable outline sketches, and you can cancel anytime. More details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thanks so much for watching this tutorial.